Okay, without further ado, I'd like to bring up Anne Tiivas. We're very happy to have Anne with us. She's been doing this work for 20 years. And it's incredible that we bring this expertise. And we're going to hear now also, we've talked a lot about football, right? Big sports, big, well-resourced sports. It's important that we not only get perspectives from around the world, but also from sports big and small. So with that, we've invited in other sports federations that we haven't heard from as of yet, and it's very important we get their perspective. So with no further ado, I'd like to turn the floor over to the very capable hands of Anne Tiivas.
Thank you very much, Mary. The first thing I'd like to say is a huge thank you for both to Dorothy and to Mary for making an increased space for us to be able to talk about child and adult protection in sport. My name's Anne Tiivas. I spent nearly 40 years in child protection. I know I don't look that old, but it has been nearly that long. And for the last 18 years, it's been almost entirely focused on violence against children and adults in sport. We have a wonderful panel coming up. I'd very much like to thank Aaron Smith, Gigi Alford, Siret Luik and Áine Power, who are going to be contributing to the panel once I've done the introductions. If you can bear with us, I don't have a clicker, so I'm going to be asking Hayley at the back there to move slides on for us. Also, because I know we're tight on time, I hope that the interpreters have had a great deal of coffee this morning. So, moving on, what I was asked to do this morning was to give a bit of background and overview to where we've been. And if we could move the slide on to what we're going to cover. Oh, it's there, sorry. That's thrown me. I was expecting it to be on the other side. So basically, in terms of background, when work first started in this area, there was no inclusion of child or human rights at all within sport. There was no policy crossover either. There were no statutory requirements on sport whatsoever to take action around safeguarding and protecting children or athletes. And also, and very importantly, I do want to focus on the messages of research. There was literally no research in this area, except for a few pioneers like Kari Fasting in the audience, the late Celia Brackenridge, who would be so delighted to see this topic being raised today. But those people, including Celia, actually received death threats when they did research in this area, which is a really frightening thing to consider. And one thing, though, that we did find was that child rights work was slightly further ahead than adults. I know that may seem hard to believe, but that was the case. And also there was no consideration to the additional rights of affected groups who may be more vulnerable to imbalances in power and abuse. And there was very little research in that area too. So if we can move the slide on. So what happened to start with? To start with, just like we've heard in recent years about the allegations in football and in gymnastics, the initial drivers for policy changes really came from high-profile cases of abuse, predominantly of coaches, either of physical or sexual abuse, that were hitting the media. And the consequences of those for sport, there were very few that actually took action proactively and thought, actually, we ought to be doing something to safeguard our participants. Most of the reactions were as a result of serious media attention, negative media attention, withdrawal of sponsorship and negative views from the public. Did the public want to send their children to swimming clubs when they were seeing Paul Hickson sentenced to 17 years for abuse of his Olympic athletes? So those first tentative steps, sports actually came to the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children in the UK and said, can we have some policy help? But actually most of the original policy interventions were based on responding to those few rogue individuals that were perceived to be the problem, not that this was actually a cultural issue about sport sitting outside of the normal regulations of everyday life that you would see in education, health, social care, and so on. And athletes were absent, and children's voices were absent from the discussion, as were their rights. And one of the things that we want to be able to see over the next few years is a seamless approach to safeguarding, regardless of your age of participation, your level of participation, and whatever vulnerabilities that we cause to you by not addressing your rights. I'm using images for the next few slides, if we can move on to the next one, really to make the point and to have a visual representation of what we're talking about, because I think it's important for people to see this sometimes. Many of you will have seen me use this slide before, and I will stop using it when all of the heads are out of the sand. Our initial response is most sports, certainly in the UK, thought, oh, if it's not to do with gymnastics or swimming, it can't be anything to do with us. They retain their heads in the sand. But the important thing about this image is that it's an oil worker who's got dirt under his fingernails. So you can put your head under in the sand, but you will still have the dirt sitting under your fingernails. So we're going to move on. Just for there may be many of you here who've got different roles in sport who may not necessarily be familiar with the subject area. So we're going to have a whistle stop through the forms of abuse that we're talking about. And we use the definitions currently that are in the International Olympic Committee consensus statement on prevention of abuse and harassment in sport. And if we can put the next slide. I'm not going to use Larry Nassar's image very much in the future. It's to make a point that most of you will connect with around sexual violence. I would be much happier to see the positive images of those people with lived experience who spoke out and are now taking action themselves to counter abuse in sport. The next slide is an image of physical abuse. I'm deliberately not showing the videos that go with this. This is about physical injury that happens in sport, often through very poor coaching techniques with people who have no idea what they're doing. This coach in the States, not only was he forcing these girls into excruciating splits, but was also making their other teammates do this to them. In the next slide, we see a little boy. I think he's 4 years old. His father wants to make sure he has every opportunity in life and isn't afraid of doing things, whatever the context, making him run in minus 13 degrees of temperature. So if we move on to the next slide, there are a number of definitions that you can look at your leisure. To clarify, because safeguarding I know is not a term that everybody is familiar with. Safeguarding is the protective things that we put in place to make sure. There are insurance policy that things are much less likely to happen. They don't prevent everything, but it's a really important thing that we need to do. And protection is what we do when we need to take action, when individual children or adults are at risk of abuse. And harm is the impact of what happens following those experiences. And violence is everything. One of the things that I want to talk about, particularly today, is around psychological and emotional abuse. It's the gateway to every other form of abuse and is very little understood. That imbalance of power enables everything else to go wrong. And then we have a whole host of other new issues to deal with around gender-based violence and in sport, and issues around adults at risk, where the definitions are slightly different and include things like financial abuse. If we can move on to the next survey, I'd really like to thank the young people who've contributed their questions and comments to the forum, and I'd like you to hold this in your heads for the rest of the session. This young person in Germany said to us, I would like big decision makers to ensure that everyone who runs sport-based programs be educated and trained in safeguarding. If we can remove ignorance, we can take action. The next slide is around policy, and the purpose of putting this up. Oh, we missed that. I've got them in the wrong one. I think we might have missed one. In terms of the research background, one of the things that's important to recognise is the additional vulnerability of many young people and adults. Tina Vertommen's study in Belgium, what it identified was that if you are any marginalised group or any group which is likely to be subject to discrimination and a power imbalance, you are significantly at risk of all forms of abuse. And that's something that we need to bear in mind when we're developing our policies. The next slide is the most recent research from Canada that was done with Athlete Can, and it focused on both current and previous and former elite athletes. And what we'll see from that slide is that psychological abuse is the most commonly reported form of abuse. And again, it provides the gateway to all other forms of harm. What we now know unequivocally is that if you are a talented young person going into sport, you are significantly more at risk of every form of those abuse. And can you think of any other job where that would be your career pathway? So if we move on, this slide is around a quote from a Holocaust survivor, again, that I wish you to bear in mind. What hurts the victim most is not the cruelty of the oppressor, but the silence of the bystander. So other people, I think, have made the same challenge today. We must all make sure that we're not bystanders and that we are able to take action. Moving on. Part of the reason for putting up this slide is around that we have different sets of regulation, and I think it's been very clear from all of the presentations that government departments and statutory bodies in child and athlete and adult protection have not been aligned with the work of child protection and adult protection agencies, and right in the middle there is the gap that we're seeking to bridge, and this forum is a massive opportunity for people to start doing the work to bridge those gaps. Next slide. So we've heard already throughout the last 2 days about all the international conventions that are in place, the intergovernmental work that is happening. I put up there, don't rely on individual governments because they change, their priorities change and resources come and go depending on the nature of the governing party, and that can slow up progress. They're important influencers, but they're not the only ones. Some things you might be less familiar with. Actually, back in 2014, we created a declaration for safe sport at Brunel University under the auspices of Celia Brackenridge. And also, more recently, Gigi Alford will talk further to this around the World Players' Declaration on Athlete Rights. Next slide. Internationally, what happened, who first took attention on an international basis? We start with UNICEF, where Marta Santos Payas and Susan Bissell from the Innocenti Centre looked at the UN Global Study on violence and thought, actually, within UNICEF, we're sending out sport for development programs around the world, and we've never once considered if they were safe. So they called together a range of experts to ask the questions and to find out what we knew, and that resulted in the publication of the first review of child protection on in sport in an international basis. Subsequently, through those connections, I met Liz Twyford. This is the coffee shop anecdote. In 2012, we sat in a coffee shop in St James's Park in London and said, what can we do in this Olympic and Paralympic year to make a difference to children and young people? Why don't we start an initiative to try and safeguard every child and young person everywhere in the world, in every sports context? And we might need some friends to do it. And that led to the development of the International Safeguards for Children Initiative and project, many of whose members are here. And we will reference the guidance document that we would like you to be familiar with and to make commitments to uphold. So if we move on to the next slide. The other thing to be aware that has changed in the last few years is with the national inquiries particularly into child sexual abuse that have been happening in countries, that sport will get brought under those now. Certainly one of the things that we saw in the UK from Operation Hydrant, which was put in place to respond to the cases of footballers talking about their experiences of abuse, was that began to take the attention of all governments, and that the focus was actually brought into the child protection inquiries. We've seen the same in the Australian Commission and in the Ropes and Gray inquiry into gymnastics in the States. In the next slide, let's move on to the hopeful stuff, more hopeful stuff about what's actually happening. And there are increasing collaborations through this centre, through the International Safeguards Project, through specialist athlete protection agencies and advisory groups and voices of those who've been affected by abuse. We'll move on to the next slide. This is a reminder, we took the opportunity through the International Safeguards for Advisory Group to have a campaign on Universal Children's Day, which asked people to take action and to use the International Safeguards as their reference point. The International Safeguards for Children in Sport has formed the inspiration for the International Olympic Committee's recent guidance document for national international federations and NOCs, and also for the FIFA Guardians Toolkit. And the leadership in those areas is leading to other organisations now taking action. If we can move on. I won't run through all of the safeguards for ease of time. If we can move on to the next slide. There are some particularly important projects, one of which you've already heard about. I fully commend Elda Marino's work and her colleagues who've worked on the Start campaign that Belen also talked about. It was such an important project, and to see those children's images and to hear what they have to say was massively important. But also the Voice project, for any of you who aren't familiar with it in Europe, was an absolutely pioneering project which brought together the voices of those who've been affected in childhood by abuse in sport. And we have some of the members of that project within the room today, and we thank you for your courage that led us to undertake this work. In the next slide, I'll be killed if I don't put this one up. For the I Protect in Sport project is a pan-European project where Gloria Viceras, a former a person with lived experience of abuse as an Olympian in gymnastics, has created a project which is developing a European platform full of tools that will help other organisations to take action and to do work at the grassroots level. It's helping clubs and coaches and parents to take action. And I'll zip through the next couple of slides. We've already talked through the IOC development, so I'll move on from those. Those are just the images of the IOC toolkit and the FIFA Guardians programme for those of you who haven't seen it. The preconditions for change. So this is really coming towards the summary before we move on to the panel discussion. We need more awareness. We need more education and training. Removing ignorance is the mantra. We need a culture change. It's not just about putting in place pieces of paper and policies and procedures. It's really changing our attitude and prioritising athlete and child well-being above everything else in sports. Listening to those people and making sure that their voices are heard at every opportunity and are integrated into our thinking. As we've heard from other people, and I think David Grevenberg summed this up very well, this is everybody's responsibility. And it takes leadership, it takes courage, and it needs a seamless approach to working across all participation levels. And a holistic approach to athlete well-being at every juncture, not just the most serious end of things. And as we've already heard, it's a plea for a multi-agency, multidisciplinary, rights-based approach. In the UK, on the next slide, what you'll see is we started this back in 2002. I actually found a historic document, European news, that we took to a call to action to the European Parliament in 2002. There was going to be a presentation by child protection professionals at the European Parliament. With the World Cup just around the corner, it is the right time to consider how we can promote sport to young people at local, national and international levels and protect them from exploitation and abuse. So it's taken a long while, but we are getting there. Next slide. We'll just show briefly the Guardians film, if that's possible. No, it's not possible. Okay, we will imagine the FIFA Guardians film and we'll see if we can find an opportunity to show it later. The next slide is really what we've been doing with Safe Sport International. If people who are on the advisory group put their hands up so that people can find them later. We have a lot of advisory group members here. Is we've been trying to share knowledge, build collaborations and help people to understand what this work is all about. We would very much like to invite you next year to come to Quebec for our second international conference. Last year we were hosted by the Spanish High Council for Sport and had the first ever global conference on safeguarding and protecting children and adult athletes in sport. We hope you'll come to join us in Quebec next year, where we're expecting around 400 or 500 of the world's top researchers, policymakers and practitioners. And moving on. These are the aims of the session. I'm going to ask the panel members to introduce themselves in a moment. And if we can put the very last slide up is, I would advise those of you who haven't seen it, if you want to understand what this means in elite sport, to watch Mary Kane's video that came out a couple of weeks ago on the experiences of elite athletes in sport. Thank you. So I'm going to ask our panel members to introduce themselves one by one. So Aaron, would you like to start?
Hello, I'm Aaron. I'm a young ambassador from Belfast in Northern Ireland. This is incredible for me to be here, and it's just such an honour. But it's something that I'm incredibly passionate, and I just love to get involved with. So I feel like my experience might be beneficial to some of the people here.
Thank you, Aaron. Gigi.
Thanks, Aaron. Good morning, everyone. My name is Gigi Alford, and I am the Director of Sport and Human Rights at the World Players Association, which brings together 85,000 professional athletes across global sport and represents the leading voice of organized athletes in the governance of global sport. I also coordinate the Sport and Rights Alliance, which is a global coalition of leading NGOs and trade unions that are committed to embedding human rights in the world of sport and representing the voice of affected groups in conversations like this.
Hello, I'm Siret Luik. I'm the Deputy Secretary General for International Archery Federation. And when I was first asked to be part of the panel, then my first thought was that maybe we are not the best example. We are doing the best we can, but among international federations, maybe we wouldn't be the best example to be me to be here, but I'm here to show the perspective from rather a smaller Olympic sport and also show that it's a journey, even if it's a journey full of struggles, it's a journey, and we have started this journey.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Áine Power. I am the Deputy Legal Director of the FEI, which is the International Equestrian Federation. We have 130 member federations across the world. I'm also, since the beginning of this year, one of the 3 members of the FEI's athlete protection team. So there's the 3 of us in FEI headquarters who are dealing with any safeguarding cases that arise. And just to say, I think Siret has been very humble because I know how hard she's been working with her federation and with a couple of other federations who are based here in Switzerland, and in particular Lausanne, to really try and put our heads together and come up and overcome the common challenges that we have. Thank you.
Thanks. If we can keep the microphone at that end, we're going to start off by asking the organisations to talk about their motivation. What got them started? Was it proactive or was it reactive?
It was a little bit of a combination of the two, I would say. I think that we could kind of feel the temperature, and we thought that it was likely that cases would be coming down the track, and we felt, okay, if that's the case, we need to be ready for that. And so there was that. We had looked in other, say, bigger countries. We saw what was happening in the States, and we said it's impossible that this is not going to affect our sport. So it was a little bit of removing the head from the sand, I would say. And also we're very lucky that at our top management, our Secretary General is also the President of the Association for Paralympic Sports Organisations. And as you mentioned, this is a category that are particularly vulnerable to this. So it was very much on her radar. And also our President is an IOC member. So I think he had heard through the IOC the work they'd done with the consensus statements. So through this, they were strongly encouraging us to get everything ready so that we would be ready when a case did arise.
And for us, I think it was also a combination. In addition, well, first of all, in a much broader wording, it has been both of ours for equestrian and archery. It has been already in our constitution or code of ethics that any form of discrimination, harassment or abuse is not tolerated. However, there were no specific procedures how to handle if a case like that comes in. It would have fallen under the same kind of procedure as any other ethics violation. So yes, there was IOC consensus that definitely gave a push, and there was also high-profile cases coming up which showed the real damage it can do to the organization if something like that hits. But it wasn't just because of that. We also had a case of our own in one of our top events, which was handled, reaction was quite fast, and the help from local organizing committee and police was very good, but it made us realize that we need to be better prepared, we need better procedures.
Thank you. And Gigi, if you can talk to us about why this subject is so important to World Players Association and what you started to do.
Right. So we approach this from the framework of the human rights of athletes at World Players Association, and that's the human rights of adult athletes, and that includes the child rights of child athletes. We really see athletes as people first, and athletes second, and likewise child athletes are children first, and athletes second. So for us, we identified a real gap in the world of representing athlete voice when it came to children, and that's where we were able to bring that nexus of embedding the rights and recognition of those identities into the constitutional documents that govern sport, into the culture and the institutions that are there to right now protect sport. We want to change that and make sure that they're there to protect people.
Thanks, Gigi. I'm now going to move on. We heard Iris speak very movingly earlier this morning that often organisations don't really know where to start. So I'm going to ask those of you who've been taking the initiative, where have you started and how have you gone about prioritising?
First of all, of course, the wording of a policy which would describe the definitions more specifically, and that was, I would say, the easiest step at first. We also started at the same time to train our staff. We made a survey among our athletes and among our staff to understand the real situation and the awareness of the topic as well, because that we felt that would be a way to measure if our work is really successful, if we are really raising awareness. And then also, of course, the procedure, working on the procedure document, and I would say that has been the most challenging so far. But.
Yeah, the same kind of similar experience. So the task kind of fell down to our legal department to draft the policy, and drafting rules, that's something that we do every day, so that was kind of something we were comfortable with, and it wasn't a huge challenge, especially when we're working off the IOC toolkit. But then what we came to realize was obviously the policy was words on a page, and when we had to go and implement it and make sure we had the structures to support the policy, that's where we were lacking a lot of experience. I'm not ashamed to say it. It's not something that we had any particular training in. And to be honest, when you accept the job, I never expected to be dealing with cases like this, to be very honest. So it was a little bit overwhelming. And we reached out actually to Áine and to Safe Sport International to help us with that, and to give us, first of all, in the athlete protection team, some training, some very simple at the start do's and don'ts. And we also had them over to help us train our headquarters staff. So something as simple as our colleague on reception, if she was ever to get a call from somebody who wanted to report this, what our reaction should be and who she should forward the call to. So even small practical steps like that were really, really helpful. Similarly, giving some training to our tribunal panel, which is our independent judicial panel, because ultimately the cases will end up with them. And so again, they hadn't significant safeguarding experience within the membership. So again, running them through case studies, and so that was something that Safe Sport International external agencies were really helpful with, because I think it's important for sports federations. It's really, really important we tackle this, but within a federation, just so you know, on a day-to-day basis, this is not what a federation bread and butter. The bread and butter is the sports, it's the competition, it's the things that people associate with a sports federation. So many federations are not so equipped to deal with this, and the more help we can get with putting the structures in place, the better, I think.
Thank you. And if I could keep the microphone with you two now, is when you first start off, as you say, for many international federations, this hasn't been seen as their core business. So, and also for senior management who may have no idea what this involves. Can you just talk us through what helped and hindered you both with your first steps, particularly with your senior management teams?
As I briefly mentioned in the first question, we're very lucky that our Secretary General and President were fully on board with this. So when we brought our policy to the FEI board at the start, we had super strong advocates within the board already in those two persons. So that was a big help. I mean, in terms of what hinders it, I think it's not a secret in the international federation world that we're mainly looking at the composition of the top leadership on a board. It's predominantly male and predominantly of an older generation. And there is a certain group within that group, a subgroup, let's say, that are not so comfortable with the language that we have to use to effectively communicate about this topic. They're not used to using words like sexual harassment on a day-to-day basis, and there was a level of discomfort, I would say. But we did want at some point to make sure that they fully understood what they were approving and what they were signing up to. So we had to kind of bring some people a little bit out of their comfort zone. But once we did that, it was easier. And similarly, when we tried to educate our national federations, even some colleagues were worried that we might offend some people due to cultural sensitivities, that they would not be able almost to receive this topic. And again, we had to push a bit and say, yes, it's uncomfortable for everybody. But that just because it's uncomfortable doesn't mean it's not going to happen in their federation. And the good thing is, in a way, is that when we did talk to these federations about it, they were so engaged, they wanted to hear more about it. They weren't actually that embarrassed, or at least not as embarrassed as people thought they might be. So it was actually a really good lesson for us all, that we shouldn't be afraid to actually tackle it.
Thank you.
Yeah, we had quite similar experience. So our top management was also very much on board with this. They were, I would even say, proactive in terms of how early in the stage of comparing with the other international federations, they raised the topic as well. But if you're asking what also helped was the initiative of international federations who felt the same way, that it's time to act, but we are not sure how to act yet. So in the beginning, it was 7 international federations who are based in Lausanne. They took contact with each other and told, okay, we have this IOC statement now, and we feel we want to act, but we are not sure how to act. So it was a pure initiative of the international federations to come around the same table and discuss how do we solve this situation, what are the next steps, and this was really helpful. So cooperation was really a key in this situation.
Thank you very much. What we're going to move on to next is, we've talked already about the importance of involving the key stakeholders. That's young people, it's athletes, it's people with lived experience. So I know, Siret, that you did in World Archery, you started some work in involving athletes right at the beginning. Do you want to talk us through that before we move to Gigi?
Well, yeah, first of all, we did a very extensive survey with our participants, our athletes, to really understand how they see this topic, how aware they are. Would they report? Would they know how to report? But secondly, when we started discussing about the policy, then we also involved a former Olympic medalist to have her later as one of our safeguarding officers. So, and I am a former athlete, so we can't say that athletes haven't been involved in this process. So we have done our best, and for the future steps, any educational tool that we are developing, our plan is to activate our Athletes Commission a lot more than we have done in the past, and definitely also regarding safeguarding education and awareness, we will use the Athlete Committee to be the ambassadors to forward the message to the athletes, because they have the biggest connection with them.
Thank you. And Gigi's going to talk us through the work you've been doing with World Players and why that's so important.
Right. So I think there's 2 aspects to this. One is the research that's needed, and then the way that cases are being processed at the moment. So when it comes to the moment we're in right now, I think we can all agree that there's a crisis in sport when it comes to protection and safeguarding of athletes and children. So this has been, I think, the driving factor, bringing a lot of sports bodies to the table. It's also been, I think, a wake-up call for a lot in the human rights community, in the children's rights community. So it is a moment that's bringing together those realms of expertise, but what needs to happen now are clear outcomes for the individuals who have been affected by this crisis, and real commitment to changing the system that has enabled it. So we're beginning with research at World Players. In 2017, we adopted a declaration on safeguarding the rights of children, of child athletes, and this was very much an application of existing international standards to child athletes. There wasn't, any inventing of new information, new rights. It was just making sure that we had a baseline of what the minimum standards were, what the expectations were. And now we're going, and through our research, we're integrating those international standards into a global measure that incorporates the Convention on the Rights of the Child. It incorporates the Universal Declaration of Player Rights. It incorporates the international safeguards of children in sport, and uses that to walk our survey respondents, the professional athletes who are currently playing, currently active, and members of player associations, about their experiences along those protected rights that they should have been aware of and should have had protected. So we're not making it a survey that's based on, opinions and sort of self-reporting about how much they care about an issue, how much they're aware about it. We're using the survey itself to educate them about what that was, to identify where those gaps are, and then the next phase is advocacy. So this pilot study will, result in a global measure that can be replicated and used in other contexts, and used over time to measure the change as this paradigm shift, this culture shift is happening. But it's also going to result in clear recommendations to sport governing bodies, to governments, and to player associations about how to make sports safer for kids in the future.
Thanks very much, Gigi. I'm going to ask you to hand the microphone to Aaron now. One of the things I've seen over the last 20 years is how difficult it is for sports organisations to involve children and young people, and they lack confidence in it. So Aaron's going to talk us through why it's so important to involve young people in solutions for things that affect them, and how he became involved, first of all, as an ambassador.
Yeah, so for me, the most important thing is consulting with young people in regards to policy, in regards to co-design of various programs and daily, everyday business operations of a sporting organisation. It just makes more sense logistically. It's the right thing, first of all. It's the ethical thing. And for young people to be empowered like that is phenomenal. And that's me speaking from experience. I've been involved with, I've been lucky enough to be involved with the Commonwealth Games Association for Northern Ireland. They were fantastic in giving me the opportunity to go and be consulted about a declaration on sport and human rights. As, like Gigi was saying, as a baseline for young people and for everybody in sport, any stakeholder in sport, to have these baseline human rights met before they move on to anything else. It's the right thing, it's the just thing. And I think that it's really important for young people to be consulted in every facet, not just at the start, but during and consistently. And the Commonwealth Games Association have been brilliant with constantly and prolonged work with young people to have a better standard for young people. And it's not always the easy thing to do. That's the standard. It's not always the easiest thing to do. As a sporting organisation, it can be difficult and it can be expensive. It's not always the cheapest. However, it is the right and the just thing to do. And it's not just the responsibility of these organizations, but it's the responsibility of the individual as well. It's just providing that responsibility to the young people in order to get to where they need to be.
So Aaron, can I just ask you, how did that first step happen for you? How did you become involved?
So originally I worked in a small youth club. I was doing volunteering in a small youth club, and over time more opportunities arose to me. Being able to co-design different programs, and eventually over time I was brought into the Young Leaders program through Dame Kelly Holmes Trust and Peace Players NI, who were fantastic in facilitating different safeguarding sessions for me as a young person to empower me, and so I knew what was right from wrong. I knew what steps to take, and I knew where to go with it. So I thought that was like a really important first step for me.
Thanks very much, Aaron. Aaron's going to tell us more about his experiences around things like safeguarding training slightly later on. I'm going to go back particularly to ask Siret and Áine about the lessons you're learning from setting up your organisation's response to concerns. We've heard a lot about the importance of remedy over the last day and a half. So what are you finding about the development of your case management systems, particularly those of you who've had them tested?
Yeah, it's been a learning process, to be honest, and from every case that we've handled so far, we've taken a few nuggets out of it that I think that when we go back to review our policy in the future, that we'll be able to incorporate it and make it better. One of the things I think that we have learned that has been working well is that the independence of the safeguarding team from the other structures within our organisation, and there are pros and cons to that, but mainly pros in that we are, in a way, protecting our cases from outside influence or undue influence. It's sports federations, as you know, are extremely political. That's mainly how they function. People always say sport is separate from politics. It's not at all the case. And so there are elections, there are everything, and people feel that they want to influence a particular process, and people will put a call in to our Secretary General or to our President regarding a case that they may have heard is ongoing, and they'll try to advocate for one way or the other. And at least with our structure, what we find is that our top management can hand on heart say, I have no influence over that case. In fact, sometimes if the case is in the very early stages, they may not even know that the case is in process, because that's the way we do it at the moment. We keep it internal until we feel confident enough that we can open a formal case. So we may just be in the investigatory phase, and they will receive calls saying, have you heard anything about this? And they can genuinely say, no, I haven't. So that it means, and it gives us a lot of power that actually our group, we can provisionally suspend officials, we can even provisionally suspend a board member, which is quite a big responsibility, but I think it shows that at least we're committed to having a true case and a fair case if it comes along. So that's been one of our key learnings, I would say, so far.
Thank you.
For us, the situation is that actually the procedure document hasn't been published yet. We will have our board meeting in a few weeks, and after that we will publish it. It doesn't mean that we haven't had cases or we haven't managed cases. And I would say that after we had workshops in our Congress and so on, the awareness has already been higher and more cases have came up. And what I have learned from it is just that it's very complex, and there is no way to be able to have this perfect procedure or perfect policy that would foresee any different scenario or case. And there are so many situations where it's very complicated to draw the line, where exactly goes the line. And that means that I think it kind of explains that why maybe the federations have been slow. At least from our perspective, we haven't ever done something sooner, haven't let something to be undone just because we are afraid to do. It's rather the lack of resources, experience, or knowledge. And we do have this wish to do, but sometimes what people from outside don't realize is how limited our resources are. And you might think that, okay, it might be the question of priorities. So do you say that safeguarding is not a priority for you? That's not the case. It's not the case. So if you would say, yeah, but maybe you would need to hire only one more person for safeguarding as a safeguarding officer. Yes, but it would be 8% of our staffing budget. It's not a small thing. So if there is anyone in the room who feels that sometimes sport organizations are not doing much, I can't talk on behalf of all the sports organizations, but there is an aspect that's sometimes difficult to understand from outside, that it might not be the willingness not to do. It is the willingness is there. It's just the struggle of really getting everyday situations solved. Because in tradition, in the past, sports organizations didn't have this role of managing such cases. So we need a little bit of time. And I think there would be a very quick solution to, as for example, as soon as the IOC statement came out, we would have had also the possibility to write a draft policy, draft a procedure, publish it, kind of bury it somewhere in our website under other documents, which can be done. But we didn't choose this path. We chose to take a little bit of time to learn from our own experience, learn from other federations, and that's why it has taken time, but it doesn't mean that we haven't done anything.
Thanks very much, Siret. I'm now going to ask Gigi to talk about what athletes are saying about how they want their reports to be handled and managed.
Thank you. I think this is, just to kind of connect it to the previous remarks, this is an area where we're seeing a willingness to begin to change. I think the issue is that it's connected to some of the areas where we're seeing less willingness to change. And what the athletes want is that entire systemic overhaul, reform of a system that has created the conditions where the systemic abuse has happened. So there's a lot to be done, I think, in the short term on really resolving the abuse, the mental abuse, the sexual abuse, the physical abuse, and also the neglect that athletes face that leads them down this corridor where harms can increasingly become more and more detrimental. Where there isn't a willingness to change right now is rectifying that imbalance of power that has created those conditions. And I think that's where the athletes are really stepping up and saying, we want more representation in the decisions that affect us. And if that had been there all along, the abuse that we're seeing now, the crisis, would not have gone on as long as it has. I think one other thing that athletes would really want is to ensure that they're not being seen as weak and helpless and in need of, the sports bodies to kind of give them this, case management. It's actually the other way around. When you look at the survivors who have come out, for the longest time, we wouldn't have cases wouldn't be exposed until the survivors were in their 40s or 50s. And so it could always be sort of, pushed aside as that was a long time ago. This doesn't happen now. But we are seeing cases that are happening in the here and now where athletes come forward. And if you look at those athletes, they are the picture of strength. The USA gymnasts, Ali Reisman, she's not weak and helpless. So, you look at the Afghan women who came forward to Kelly and Khalida, that the strength that took. When you look at Shim Suk-hee in South Korea and her teammates who have come forward and disclosed the serial rape they were facing from their coach, countless others. You mentioned Mary Kane earlier. When you watch her video, the power behind her voice is remarkable. So then you ask the question, well, what gives? How can such powerful, brave individuals with that courage, that strength, that self-awareness be subject to this kind of violence? Well, it tells you it's because they're up against even more powerful forces, and we're not okay with that. I think there has to be something that balances that power. In terms of what athletes want for, resolving this, it's really about recognizing those rights, and then also a recognition of the responsibility on the part of sports bodies for respecting human rights, which means do no harm. And it means, know what the vulnerabilities, what the risks are within your operations. So this is a really clear framework. It has, the first step is a commitment to those rights, and then conducting due diligence, and then remediating harm where it happens. So it's a first step. Because the implementation, I think, is the part that we're talking about here. But this particular issue around the abuse of children and athletes in sport seems to be where it's starting.
Thanks, Gigi. Before I move on to ask Aaron about what children and young people tell us their worries are, there's a couple of points I wanted to pick up that came out in the discussion yesterday as well. One is about the use of language. We really shouldn't be referring to things as historic abuse. They really are not historic. It places them too far in the past. And actually those people are still living those experiences every day. A salutary thing that came out of Operation Hydrant, the police and investigation into allegations of abuse in football, the first question that the police ask in those cases is there a current risk? And actually, so that they need to take action about whether there might be currently people affected. And within the sports sector, differently from other sectors where it typically is around 40 or 50%, it was 90% of those cases presented current safeguarding issues, and they were either because those people were working with children or adults in sport who shouldn't be there, or because of the knock-on effects on families of broken marriages, domestic abuse, psychological problems, and families and whole entourages being affected, with parents of those children, those athletes, killing themselves because they didn't know what was happening and didn't know what to do. So when we think about case management, it's not just about that hearing and that investigation, it's all of the things that need to be put in place around it. So often we don't ask young people what worries them. We think we might know, but unless we ask, we don't know. So Aaron's going to talk to us about what we need to think about in terms of what really worries children and young people in sport.
So the reoccurring theme and the reoccurring issue that comes up time and time again is bullying, as saw in the NSPCC study. The issue with that is that it's a double-edged sword to some degree. You can be bullied for anything, and it's often situational. It can be for having incredible ability. It could be having little to no ability in the sport. So no matter what, somebody can be bullied, a young person can be bullied, regardless. And it's tough for young people to get past that. Whenever it's not just abuse from coaches and from people of influence that we have to worry about. There's issues in regards to your peers as well. So there should be policy there and put in place to safeguard young people, but you have to think about equity and stuff as well. I think equity is an incredible thing if used correctly. You can't have one size fits all policy that's going to fit every scenario, every young person. It's not going to happen. and that has to be thought about in policy making to protect young people. Another issue that I found myself just within my area is this idea of patronizing, being patronized. Like, for example, me sitting here at 18, it's a huge thing for me. But it doesn't warrant a pat in the head or a pat in the back and say, oh, well done, congratulations. Like, I'm up here to make a difference, and that's what I'm here to do. And it's not for anybody else's benefit. I'm not doing it for people. I'm hoping it's not tokenistic. I'm up here to speak on behalf of young people and speak about the issues that they face, because they're very real and in every sector of society. So it's just something, it's food for thought, if nothing else.
I did ask Aaron if we could see what success meant for him. If this was not going to be tokenistic, what would success be? And you tell us your response.
So if they succeed, then I won't be here again, hopefully. I don't want to sit up here and reiterate over and over again that, oh yeah, do the right thing. It should have been a given already. It should already be in place. And I'm standing here on behalf of young people as a young person, telling you that it needs to be in place, telling everyone it needs to be in place. It's just providing the opportunities, it's providing the responsibility and the role and accountability for young people to help make that difference within themselves and within their own communities.
Thanks, Aaron. And the last question I had for you was the second of the NSPCC reports that were funded by UEFA a few years ago. We asked children what their worries were, but the second thing we did was we asked them where would they turn to for help. And it wasn't always the obvious answers, and it certainly wasn't statutory agencies. So, Aaron, do you want to talk us to that?
Yeah, through that report, it was discovered that it's mainly youth workers and coaches that young people would go to over the likes of parents or teachers, as some people may have thought. For me, it's to do with that level of mutual respect and level of trust, because obviously in sport are kind of invulnerable in that, and pretty locked in regards to other facets. Let's take business, for example. In business, it's fairly open. But in sport, you don't really have that. The volume of sports clubs, the volume of opportunity, it's daunting, and it's something that's quite difficult to tackle. But it's something that should be taken into account, is that there is this level of trust, and it's something that is being abused, unfortunately, as sad as it is. So it's just providing that level of knowledge to young people of what is right and what is wrong, and having that responsibility and that power within themselves to make themselves safer, because they will be safer if they are empowered.
Thanks, Aaron. And I think also what young people told us in that survey was that they were actually very unlikely to go to their teachers. They felt much more confidence actually in turning to sports coaches. So the other side of the coin is that close and important relationship with coaches and others actually enables them to spot when a child's in difficulty in other parts of their lives. Before we move on to talking about education and training, we have a statement to be made from Nith Cohen, who is from the Asia Pacific region. And where is he? Hi, would you like to tell us the statement you'd like to make to the panel and to the audience at this point?
Good morning. I'm Nith from Cambodia. I work for the ASA Foundation and a fellow member of the UNESCO Youth and Sport Task Force Asia Pacific. And I would like to share with you briefly the perspective of the youth from Asia Pacific region in making sport safer. This information was gathered through the UNESCO Youth and Sport Task Force for the Asia Pacific region. So we see four main areas of concern. So firstly, we see major issues with violence and abuse from coaches. So we would like to see more awareness rising on the importance of safeguarding among trainers. It would be helpful to have more cultural and regionally relevant material on safeguarding. Secondly, we see a major issues with gender discrimination. So we would like to see more done around gender sensitization. So last but not least, we are facing a major issues with climate change. Therefore, preparedness on risk reduction should be a critical consideration with safeguarding. So finally, we see it is increasingly difficult to sustain safe physical and public space. So we believe children and youth participating in sport need to know more about their rights, and it should be mandatory for trainers to undergo safeguarding training. So our takeaway message is no sport should be happen without considering safeguarding. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. I think it's a really, really important point, and it leads on to the next set of questions, which is really around eradicating ignorance and using education and training for everybody. And we'll start actually the other way round, actually. Could we start with Aaron to talk about, people are often very, very nervous about taking that step where to involve young people and talk to them about safeguarding and talk to them about protection. So do you want to talk to us about your experience of having safeguarding training and why it's important for young people?
Whenever whenever I was 15 or 16, we were provided safeguarding training facilitated by the Department for Communities to help empower us in a way in order to change the mindsets of ourselves, which is fairly institutionalized from where I come from. It gave you an opportunity to meet with other people you had never met before, and maybe would never have the opportunity to. You were given that safeguarding training, and not only that, but you were given the tools and the resource to go out and facilitate this safeguarding training with other young people, which is phenomenal, because it means that now I know my own rights. I am aware of my own rights, and I can go and I can, we did with the Young Leaders Programme, we facilitated this safeguarding training, whether it be in good relations, whether it be in conflict resolution, to young people all across Northern Ireland, ages 11 to 16. So they knew their rights, they knew right from wrong, and it empowered them. And there seems to be a common misconception where safeguarding training is only for older people, but it's not. It's in fact, it probably makes more sense to provide the safeguarding training whenever you're younger, because that's whenever it's going to apply to you. There seems to be a lot of talk about young people are the future, all children are the future. Children aren't the future, they're now. And it needs to be well known. And by the time any of these changes come into play, the young people that are being used as an example are already older. And these changes and these implementations need to be made now.
Thanks, Aaron. I'm going to move it on to Siret and Áine to talk about the education and training plans that their organisations have already been working on, or what they've received and what they're looking to do for their whole workforce.
So, yes, in terms of education, we have already done some, we plan to do something, but I think it's very important to state that from our perspective, we don't want to see the safeguarding topic as that's only related to athletes or it's only related to children. This topic affects every walk of life, and in the same way, all of our participants, everybody who are involved in our sport, could be affected. So in terms of education as well, it's necessary to think about that it needs to get to everybody, not only athletes and children, also to officials, coaches, volunteers, everybody. And regarding that, I'm really sincerely hoping that the work that international federations are doing at the moment, that the national Olympic committees are also working on national levels, and that there are enough organizations who are helping with that on the national levels, because we can do as much as we can do, and we are trying to do our best. And in our events, for example, we have the youngest group is U18, so about around 16 to 18-year-olds, but it doesn't mean that the under 16-year-old children don't do archery. They do it, but they do it in their home clubs, in their home countries, and we won't have this power to reach out every single archer or every single child who's doing archery in the world. So in terms of that, we hope there is a lot of work done in every country as well, but in the reality, when we look at the situation, then the level of this progress is very, very different. If some of the Western countries are ahead of international federations by far, and in some countries the discussion hasn't started yet. So that's my take on the education side.
Yeah, I think we probably need to distinguish between awareness and education, because I think there's a big difference between the two, because we can tell everybody, yes, we have a policy, yes, we have a structure, and that's kind of just top down, you're aware of it. But if we're educating, it's more of it takes a lot more resources, it takes a lot more time if you're going to do it well. And one of the important points we picked up along the way, actually through our work with Safe Sport International, was don't really go full speed ahead with your education until you have your own house in order. And it was really, really practical advice, because we were in a small bit of a panic. We said, oh my God, we need to tell everyone about it. We need to make sure that they know who to contact, etc. But then the advice was, and it's really practical advice, yes, but then if you get a wave of cases in, are you ready to handle them? And the reality was that at that point, we wouldn't be. We're improving all the time. But that was really helpful for us to know, and just a very practical piece of information. So we are working on it, but you know, it's important, I think, if we are going to tell our national federations that they need to do this, and you know, don't get me wrong, they do need to do this, but we need to be an example ourselves, because sometimes when you're in an international federation, everybody knows that the structure of sport is kind of triangular, and the international federation more or less sits at the top of that triangle. And there can be a feeling among national federations, sometimes rightly, that there's a kind of an ivory tower complex. Isn't it well for you over there in Switzerland telling us what to do, and you've all your resources, a nice headquarter, but it's us at the coalface. So I think we need to show them that we're doing it ourselves. It applies within our own headquarters. And we need to, I think, share, when we're educating, we need to share our own struggles and our own challenges in doing it, that we're not living in this perfect world where we have everything sorted, that everything is perfectly covered off. It's not the case. I think that's an important part. It's an important part of the education message, that we're going to struggle in this, but we're going to struggle together, hopefully, and that hopefully through that, you know, we need to acknowledge our weaknesses as well, and hopefully ask federations for help, not just tell them what to do.
Thank you.
Something on education? Yeah. So the World Players Association, we have something called the Player Development and Wellbeing Standard. And this is something that was developed by watching what our affiliates do that was working. And so creating that to become a global measure that then others can follow. So it really built on best practice, it built on experience, but then it's trying to share it back into the field to make sure that this isn't something that's just practiced by a few in some places, but actually becomes global. I think the element is education has to come with some incentive and resources behind it. And one of the powerful levers that sports bodies have is access to those competitions and access to the revenue that's generated at those competitions. And that's important to make sure that these standards become requirements and that there is a holistic approach. So it's education, but with some compliance checks.
Thanks very much, Gigi. I'm just going to move things slightly back, and I'll come back to you to talk about the importance of research. But one of the things that I think people are struggling with is where they might have already put child protection policies in place, they're now putting adult protection policies in place. And although there are a lot of overlaps, there are some key differences, and I wondered if Siret and Áine would be able to talk to that.
Of course, what comes to children, it's much more sensitive, and if there is a situation where we need to prioritize the cases, then of course the cases regarding children are much higher in that pile. But I think I better give to Áine because they have more experience with that. I would say so far we don't have huge lessons learned in this matter.
Yeah, thanks, Siret. I think with the adult cases, I think what we're finding is that they're probably more multi-layered in that there may have been, the people involved in the case may have known each other in different ways over the course of maybe a long athlete coach career or something like that, or even as an official. Some of our officials are 60 or 70 years old. That doesn't mean that they're still not subject potentially to harassment or abuse. But what we have found so far, and one of the things we found difficult to distinguish is, where is this a case of just a true personal dislike, a rolling battle that's been going on, a rivalry that's been going on within a subset of a community for many years? And when is it a true case of bullying or harassment? And I think maybe, I'm definitely no expert on this topic, but I think maybe that's more of a factor in the adult cases where that's what we found. And one of the things that we have found is maybe that people have come to the end of the line with a particular personal dispute, and now that they see this new avenue, which is a policy against harassment and abuse, and say, I am now going to take a case against this person for harassment and abuse. And so it's very difficult, and sometimes it's a he said, she said case, but these, and somebody told us at the start of this case, the more serious cases, the cases of rape or abuse, or where it's a true crime, are horrific, but they're somewhere more easier to deal with on a case management basis. Whereas these cases with the grey areas are truly difficult for us to know where the truth lies and how we should tackle it. And for us so far, those are the cases that have involved adults. So I'm not sure if that's just a unique experience for our federation, if it's something a bit more general, but that's a difference we've noticed so far.
Thank you. I think probably one of the things I'd want to flag up is that where cases involve children, you have no choice. You must act, things must be reported. For adults, they have more choice around and control over what happens and when it happens, and whether they're prepared to give evidence. Because I'm sure that there are an awful lot of questions, I'm going to move the panel on very quickly just to have some last words. First of all, Gigi, on research and the importance of research, and then monitoring and evaluation, and then we'll open the floor.
Right. So, Anne, in your introduction, you mentioned the research that's happened in Canada as a collaboration between University of Toronto and Athletes Can, which is a peak body representing multi-sport athletes at the Olympic and elite athlete level, and they had some staggering findings. More than 1,000 current and former, mostly current athletes filled out the survey and reported that over 75% of them had faced some sort of maltreatment in sport, which is, mind-boggling to think about, and has actually led to a campaign and potential policy change within the country to establish some sort of safe sport policy and mechanisms for remediation and case handling at the national level. And I think that's where, at World Players we come down on research, that it has to be policy-driven. It's not only to understand the esoteric and academic figures, but to really do something about it. And so to design that research in a way that helps with that intervention. But we have to be really careful about it, because we don't know if the research that we do now, the methodology that we use, is fit for purpose. It's very much rooted in a biomedical kind of frame, whereas this is really about social science, social research. And I know that Dr. Becker at University of Bath is doing research on what new types of methodologies we can use. We also have to think about who we're not capturing in our research. There's experience in the Global South that is going largely unreported and unresearched, and that's something that has to be addressed. But then, lastly, we just have to get started. I think the courage to actually ask the questions and ask them in a way that's going to potentially surface cases. I think a lot of actors worry that this is going to open up the floodgates. Well, if that's your attitude, you're already approaching this from the wrong attitude, the wrong point of view. And so being able to come in and say, we really want to understand the scope of this problem so that we can fix it, is the question. And so that's something, I don't know if we're going to come back to this, but I don't think so. So just to say that the project that we're doing at World Players is called Project CARE. It stands for the Census of Athlete Rights Experiences. And it's a collaboration with Loughborough University. So we are working with academic partners. And frankly, it is right now a prevalence study. So it is more in this older type of methodological research. But the questions we will be asking are, can we do this research better, and can we make it more impactful?
Thanks, Gigi. And it's a very neat segue to Kari Fasting, who can put her hand up. Kari is the co-chair of the Research and Evidence Network that we've just taken over from the Brunel International Research Network for Athlete Wellbeing. It's just had its first meeting, and they will be meeting together and inviting researchers from around the world to come together in Quebec next April. So questions, Mary.
Thank you. First of all, I'm Mary Robinson, the chair of the Centre for Sport and Human Rights. I'm very sorry I couldn't be here yesterday, but I've really enjoyed both panels this morning. My pleasure was enhanced by the Irish accents on the earlier panel and on this one, I must say. And I want to talk to the Northern Ireland accent, Aaron, because I know from Mary Harvey, I think you were lucky enough to go on a delegation to Kigali in Rwanda. And it must have been very interesting to talk to young Rwandans. Can you tell us a bit about that? I think it's really good that we've had voices of young people directly, also from Asia. But what was that experience?
Kigali was phenomenal. Meeting with young people who are very like-minded, and they have the same attitude of. It was inspiring. We had the opportunity to learn about Rwanda's history, and that really solidified the experience for me. It was incredible. To have young people from Rwanda with similar attitude, the progression and for moving on, and about unity. It was a real sense of community and unity, and like we were talking about yesterday, this sense of this idea of agachiro, where dignity, that was a huge thing for me. They all share the same attitude of dignity and respect for everybody, and to move forward as a collective. It draws a lot of parallels here, I think, which is pretty incredible. This idea of collective action, where we all work together to try and reach a common goal and try and make the future brighter for everybody. So yeah, that was something that I really carried on. I thought was incredible. So.
Thank you very much, Sharon. I just learned that there's a young woman from Rwanda across the way Would you like to say something?
It's a very interesting point that Aaron just made, and I see that I feel that agaciro, or the value of dignity, should be not just for Rwandans but for everybody, because it's a beautiful example of resilience. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I think the first question is Catherine.
Thank you very much, Anne, and to all the speakers for sharing your experiences, and also to my former president, Mary Robinson. Thank you for all the work you've done and for recognising our accents. My question in particular is for Áine and Siret. It would be great to have to hear more from you about your experience of your case management system, and in particular handling cases and how you in particular establish jurisdiction for investigation, and how that links with and works with national authorities if it is of course a crime that has happened at national level. So just a bit about that distinction and jurisdictional issues and challenges that you face in your case management system.
Okay, so our experience is rather small, but I can say that generally the principles that we have been following is that, first of all, to keep the group of people who are involved with the case management as small as possible, but as big as necessary. So to have people who are really necessary for that case, because every case is a bit different, and as the definitions that Anne put on screen before is involving sexual harassment, physical harassment, but also psychological harassment, and the people to really understand how to approach this case might be needed different. So we have identified a pool of people who could help with that, and also if the case is only on national level, let's say it's not something that happened in our event but is happening in one of our member associations, then it is, first of all, we are looking if that country, if that federation, or if that National Olympic Committee has a procedure in place. So if possible, it first goes to them, and then we will of course wait back for the results. And it's the same with law enforcement. If it goes to police, then we will wait the outcome of the police investigation and the sanctions from there, and then we are assessing if it's a risk to our participants, further risk to our participants as well. And in general, we have approached that whenever possible, we will mutually acknowledge the decisions. So if a national federation takes a decision to suspend someone, we will assess if it's a fair decision, and we will acknowledge that, and we accept to do this to be done vice versa as well. So if we suspend someone, that there wouldn't be one of our member associations would actually work together with that person.
Yeah, thanks for the question. We have the same mutual recognition. I have to say the jurisdictional point is really difficult. When we're dealing with potentially a criminal system in one country that may or may not align with the system that we have in our policy. At the FEI level, we've incorporated our policy into our general regulations, so it's a formal rule. And we have the principle of covered individuals, which comes from the IOC toolkit, which is a very wide range of people that we can exert jurisdiction on. Basically, anybody that's registered with the FEI or has been accredited at an event. The person who is making the allegation does not need to be a covered individual, so it can be somebody from outside the community who can refer a case to us as long as it involves one of those people. But yeah, dealing with a multi-jurisdictional case is really difficult. We have a case in Eastern Europe that's ongoing, and I obviously won't go into the details of it, but it's quite a particular case because the person who made the allegation initially also reported it to the local authorities, to the police. So at one point, and also it came to the FEI's attention, and we opened up a case. And so at one point we had parallel investigations. But then, due to probably being put under pressure and a small bit of misinformation, the person who made the allegation chose to withdraw the criminal complaint, but actually contacted us proactively and said, I've done that because I was informed that I couldn't have the two cases going on in parallel. So, and you know, this is a real example of the vulnerable position that people are in, and that they are not lawyers, they're not native English speakers even, and so we are still going ahead with that case at our level, but it obviously has been complicated by the fact that the criminal case is ongoing, because if we had a criminal case to point to, it makes our case stronger, but we feel certain that we still have a duty to act, particularly when the victim in this case has specifically asked us to do. But we know that our chances potentially of prosecuting this case successfully are a little bit hindered. And similarly, when we have a criminal case somewhere else where the person has been charged, but you know, under the criminal system they're innocent until proven guilty. But our question is, we need to approach it not from a criminal point of view, but from a safeguarding point of view, and say, is it appropriate that this individual is still able to attend events, interact with people while this charge is pending? And, you know, and there are definitely split opinions on this, and some people think that we are overstepping our mark, but we say, okay, as long as we approach it from a safeguarding point of view, we take the case objectively, we act natural justice, right to be heard, all of that, I think we can justify that decision, but it's not a perfect solution.
Thanks. And one of the things I'd want to add to that is you absolutely cannot rely on the criminal justice system to protect anybody. Probably 3 to 5% of cases will ever end up in criminal cases, in criminal court. So you have to rely on sports being able to take their own action. I'm really aware there's a gentleman at the back who's been trying to speak for some time, so I'm going to move on to him if that's all right.
Thank you very much, and I ignored this morning to introduce myself. My name is Willie Littlechild, and I'm the International Chief for Treaties 6, 7, and 8 in Canada, and I'm glad Canada was mentioned this morning, but I wanted to make a quick link from yesterday's discussion on remedy. I wondered if there was a place for in the remedy framework for cultural relevance in terms of considering the elements of remedy. And I say that because of our experience. When we look at the business and human rights guidelines, there's a gap there. There's a gap, and what's missing is the cultural relevance. And someone this morning mentioned mental health. And that's why I wanted to link that with this particular panel, because when you talk about safety and safeguarding and protecting athletes, we found that before you do that, you have to have a safety framework, a safe framework. And by that I mean you have to have a protection for physical and mental abuse. You have to have protection for cultural, psychological, sexual abuse. And in all of that, the most important element is actually the cultural relevance. And I'm wondering if in this discussion, there's room for consideration of that safety net that includes cultural relevance in terms of dealing with safeguarding and protection. Thank you.
Thank you, and apologies that I was struggling to hear. It's partly because I'm completely deaf in one ear and hadn't got the earpiece on. But I think what I've understood you saying is the really important point about however we implement this. We're talking about a massive diversity of cultures, both within sport and outside of sport. And that needs to be taken into account when you're implementing in such diverse contexts, and you to engage stakeholders in that. I hope that gives a simple response to that. And hopefully we can look at that in the response to the Special Rapporteur's report as well. We'll take one more question, then we've got to wrap up. Gentleman in the middle.
Thank you. Good morning, all. My name is Saurabh Mishra. I'm from India. I'm under the Commonwealth Secretariat's Young Professionals Program as part of their Sport for Development and Peace team. It is well documented that the benefits of participation in physical education and sport can be extremely pronounced for children. However, a drift towards professionalism in competitive sport has also been associated with compromises of the rights of young athletes, ranging from physical and emotional abuse to doping and trafficking in many cases. We often see that the responsibility for the well-being of children and adolescents is delegated to states or national organizations and agencies. At the level of international sporting organizations, though, are there any standardized policies concerning minimum age limits for competitive sport or any standardized protocols regarding the movement of children and adolescents for the participation in sport? Thank you.
So, as far as I know, I would say no, because it's very much dependent on the sport. So case by case, we can't compare with, for example, gymnastics with rowing, where the average age is very different. But sport by sport, there might be, but if you question, there might be limitations. But if you're asking for standardized minimum age limit recommendations, requirements for sports, I'm not aware of.
No, it tends to be individual sports. Sorry, I'm shouting at myself now. It tends to be within individual sports, particularly those who've been vulnerable around the impacts of the age brackets they're working to. So gymnastics, for instance, have reduced the age at which you can compete in international competitions, although that has led in some cases to people falsifying their ages in order to participate. But equally in high-impact sports like rugby and so on, you have to look at what point can you start competing because of the injury risks, which is another issue. But thank you for the question. That does need to be taken into account. I'm really under pressure now, I think, to wrap up. Colin's got one more. Is
that working? Yes. Excellent. Right. Don't have a question. I sort of have a celebration, really. I think we'll all agree. We all agree that abuses take place because of power, a maldistribution of power. And I think we all agree that probably the royal road to making this less likely to happen is if we push power down and give voices to people lower down. It is so important that Aaron is here today, and it speaks volumes to me, because he is the future, he is the opportunity. It's telling us that we are taking this seriously. And he is out there doing advocacy at his young age. And I say, good on you, mate. It's fantastic. You're the future. You're what we want to hear. And it's great to hear you. So well done for that. I should be sick. Maybe we can have a chat later.
Thank you. And I think he's also said he is the now. And that's a big takeaway message. Can I thank the panel enormously for a great session? Thank you.